Yes, hi, Dr. Paul.
Hi there. Listen,
Hello.
We have a lot of people on that are so eager to hear from you. I'm going to introduce you to Danelle. Danelle is my partner, and she is based in Fort Lauderdale. And then I'm going to let her introduce herself to you. She's the
okay,
kind of doctor you like.
the kind of doctor I like. Now, what would that be?
A
I'm gonna
doctor
I'm,
who's
I'm gonna tell
coming to
you.
our side.
Okay,
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Danelle Kuttner. I'm a board certified physician practicing advanced regenerative aesthetics and root cause medicine in South Florida. I'm currently completing my fellowship right now in integrative and functional medicine. Today's conversation sits right at the intersection of what so many of us clinicians are trying to bring into practice, which is evidence-based, personalized medicine that actually changes outcomes. Our focus today is test-based pharmaconutrition, namely omega-6-3 testing. I've used it in my own life, I've used it with my family and with patients, and I've seen the huge impact that it has on decreasing inflammation, improving mood, and increasing energy. So, joining me today is Dr. Paul Clayton. He is an expert clinical pharmacologist and one of the pioneers of pharmaconutrition. He is a previous chair of the Forum on Food and Health at the Royal Society of Medicine and is also a fellow of the Institute of Food, Brain, and Behavior at Oxford. His work spans public health policy, historical nutrition science, and clinical trials on functional food interventions. He's also brought necessary attention to the four drivers of chronic disease and how we can reverse this trend using targeted nutrition strategies. It is a real honor to have you here, Dr. Clayton. Welcome.
well, Daniel, it's such a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for inviting me on your podcast. And it sounds as if we're quite close philosophically as well, because I'm hearing what you're studying, what you're doing, and I think that we're probably going to find that we're pretty closely aligned on a number of these subtopics.
I believe
So,
so.
how would you like to structure this? Would you like to grill me lightly with a little
Yes,
salad on the side, or
yes,
do we have just
a
have a
light grill, absolutely.
okay? All right.
So, yeah, let's get started. So, can you tell us what actually is pharmaconutrition and how does it differ from conventional nutritional approaches?
I think that the problem with nutrition, and there are many problems, is that I would say that most doctors are not very comfortable with it. They're not trained in it, and the it's a little bit too holistic for most of them, unless they've had the kind of training that you have. I'm I'm a clinical pharmacologist, and then for decades now, I've been studying the pharmacological attributes of foods and food extracts. And pharmaconutrition really describes the application of that very extensive set of pharmacological attributes to the management, prevention, and now increasingly the treatment of the non-communicable chronic degenerative diseases.
Yes, so one of those pillars that you talk about is type B malnutrition. Can you
Indeed.
explain that to our audience and discuss why it's so often overlooked in traditional care?
The reason why a lot of it is overlooked is we have this vague understanding that the modern diet and lifestyle is responsible for a huge burden of disease and premature, which really means preventable death in the public health landscape. And we know that there is something that's wrong with the modern diet. And we have this vague feeling that ultra processed foods, which we know are calorie dense and nutrient light, are playing a part in this. However, malnutrition is, again, it's a rather vague term, and you have to be a little bit more granular if you want to really get the doctor's attention and explain to them that there is some sort of a problem here. If they talk about malnutrition at all, if they're taught about malnutrition at all, as I was at medical school, and I'm sure you were too, we were shown the classical sort of type A malnutrition, which is generally it is a third world phenomenon. It often is associated with wasting, kwashiorkor, and with micronutrient deficiency syndromes. So the well-known ones are scurvy, beriberi, pellagra, think conditions like that. Um, and there or our medical ancestors have recognized these conditions for quite a long time now, because the time that elapses between the more or less complete removal of these micronutrients from the diet and the subsequent immersion of a constellation of clinical symptoms generally occurs over a really short time scale, a couple of months, because these are classically micronutrients which are not particularly effectively stored in the body. So when you stop taking them, you start running into trouble. And so because the time that elapses between the removal of the micronutrient and the symptoms is only a couple of months, our medical ancestors were able to make that connection. And also because one case of scurvy looks pretty much like another case of scurvy, and the same with those other diseases. This is not what we see today. I don't think very many of my colleagues have seen a case of scurvy ever. Although it is possible to do that. Every now and then we see letters in the medical press. A doctor says, "Hey, I found a case of scurvy," because it's someone who was eating an extremely restricted and neurotic kind of a diet. It can happen, but that's not what we see in the main. We see something called type B malnutrition. And this is quite distinct from type A. And it is characterized by multiple micro and phytonutrient depletion, not deficiency. And it's very often combined with calorific excess. So how did we get here? Well, humans evolved eating basic produce, eating what they could farm or fish or hunt or grow. So these are unprocessed or minimally processed foods. They tend to have a high nutrient density and a low calorie density. What is more, prior to the age of the internal combustion engine and information technology, a good deal of work involved physical activity. So people were consuming more calories than we tend to do today and eating more food, but it was nutrient dense, calorie light. So they end up taking on board quite significantly higher levels of many of the vitamins and minerals, the classic micronutrients, but also a range of phytonutrients than we do today. We're burning less calories. So your typical urbanite or metropolitan, your desk jockey is maybe burning 2,000 kilocalories a day, which is an historical low point. We can do that because so much of our work is automated. And what are we eating? Well, we're eating a lot of ultra-processed foods, particularly in North America, which tend to be micro and phytonutrient light and calorie dense. So we end up with a problem which is characterized by people who tend to be, more often than not, they're overweight. And when we get them into the lab and actually drill down into them to find out what their micronutrient status is, we find that today that most people are low in just about everything, because they're eating relatively low levels of food, low nutrient density. So they're low in most of the vitamins. I know here in North America you call them vitamins. Please bear with me. They're low. They're low in the trace elements, or what we call the minerals, and they're low in a very, very wide range of other nutrients as well. So typically, your xanthophylls and carotenoids, your polyphenols, conditionally essential amino acids and amino sugars, different fiber types. People are very depleted in those. And of course, as you were alluding to earlier yourself, some of the key essential fatty acids, and the omega-3s figure very highly in that group. How does this manifest itself? It doesn't show up as a deficiency syndrome at all. In fact, the signs, the clinical symptoms, the end result of type B malnutrition generally takes several decades to eventually come to the surface and present as a clinical symptom. And when it does, it's generally the clinical symptom of one or more of the chronic degenerative non-communicable diseases. And the one which appears first is really determined by the individual's genotype, epigenotype, metabolome, and various other lifestyle factors. But when you go below the surface, they may well have symptoms of coronary artery disease because they have this really substantial constellation of depletion. What we find is that they have the signs of many of the other chronic degenerative pathologies at a slightly earlier and perhaps preclinical form. Now, Danielle, you know as well as I do that by the time people are getting into middle age, late middle age, generally have signs of more than one chronic degenerative disease. And these people are expensive to treat. They're complicated to treat. They take up a lot of clinical resources. And this is one of the reasons why I think here in the United States, we're spending almost 20% of GDP on healthcare. This is a financial road to ruin. And it's very clear that the pharmaceutical industry has been unable to rectify this. We need to go back to basics. And that means pharmaconutrition.
Absolutely. So, I mean, aside from that, how do we overcome the challenges of the Western diet that, is so clear in the United States and now has been infiltrating the rest of the world with ultra processed foods? And even in our grocery stores, they're not helping us to make
No,
better choices and, putting in extra ingredients into things that should be simple, like oats. So how do we get past this? And have you seen any other countries that are doing this better?
absolutely yes. Um, I think let's first of all dispel any idea that people may have as to the as to the benign nature of the food companies. They are not interested in our health at all. They are actually, I would describe them as public health criminals. They are concerned with selling food which is hyper palatable, which has a long shelf life, which has a high profit margin per square foot of shelf space in the store. Um, that's really all they care about. They're not interested in our health at all. Every now and then, a company makes some sort of vaguely worded claim. This is, good for, bloating. This one, this is healthier than this. But that's not their prime interest at all. They're interested in making profits. They absolutely know that they're killing us. I get to speak to the CEOs of a lot of the very major multinational food companies. They absolutely do know that they are poisoning us and killing us. That's not their concern. There is no regulatory system in place that would prevent them from behaving in this way. And for them, it's business. It's not personal. It's just business. That's the environment that we now live in. Could we do it better? Yes, we could. And there's two ways of doing this. You can either reconfigure someone's diet by presenting to them a well-designed program of the missing micro and phytonutrients, which you can give in tablets and powders and potions. This is what Zinzino does, and that's one way of doing it. I think I regard that as a kind of an intermediate strategy. At the end of the day, people just want to eat healthy food. I think, how do we square this circle? And the answer is very simple. It is perfectly possible to make ultra-processed foods which are actively healthy. The current generation of ultra-processed foods is not. We know that the more ultra-processed foods you eat, the more likely you are to develop heart disease, type 2 diabetes, neurodegenerative disease, and in fact experience pathological aging of the entire acceleration of the entire biological aging process. This is a recent study by Esposito, which you've probably come across. Really, really bad for us. But ultra processed foods don't have to be that way. It's perfectly possible to make foods which are, as the ones we have are today, hyper palatable, long shelf life, plenty of profits for the food company. You simply have to re-engineer the way in which they're produced. And one country is doing that, and that's Japan. Now, Japan have a food sector which they refer to as foshu. And what has happened over the last few decades is more and more of these foods have entered the Japanese market, and average life expectancy has increased quite significantly as a result. Now, average life expectancy in a nation is a very crude yardstick of general health, but it is saying to us that their health is improving in the most general sense. Whereas here in the North America, in Britain, in many other countries, it's either flatlining or actually declining, as is health expectancy. Will that ever come to the United States? Well, I think it might. Up until now, none of the food companies has been particularly active in this space, the big food companies. And the reason is the regulatory system will not allow them to make significant health claims. So even if they were to spend a little more on ingredients and make a food that instead of being damaging was actually supporting your health, even if the food companies were to do that, the FDA and the various other regulatory parts of the apparatus here in North America would not allow them to make meaningful claims. That just can't happen. So there are, even if there were good players in the food space, I'm not sure that they are motivated to go down this particular road. But if you'll give me a few moments more, I'll explain to you what happened in Japan. There used to be a lot of very small players, very forward thinking, but people, companies of maybe a half a dozen, 20 employees, they were selling little local functional foods in this grocery sector locally, not making much of an impact on the market. One day, some senior executive in a couple of the big Japanese companies, Meiji and Ajinomoto, as it happens, they produced functional foods as well. They took a leaf from these small companies' books and released a couple of products, not really thinking, I don't think, that it was going to be hugely successful, but these really took on. And now the other big companies saw, hey, we have to get onto this bandwagon or we'll be left behind. So the market changed quite radically in a short period of time. And the good news that I'm here to share with you is that there is one very, very major player in the food space right here in North America that is looking at this right now. The reason I know it is they've asked me to advise them on this next generation of pro-health functional foods, which I think when they are finally launched are going to surprise everybody.
That's wonderful. You know, I think consumers are getting much smarter and noticing that chronic low-grade inflammation does truly relate to aging and chronic disease. So let's get into how the if if the omega-3 6:3 ratio really does address all four drivers of chronic disease, meaning chronic inflammation, gut dysbiosis, type B malnutrition, and glycemic mismatch.
No, in a word, no. It's not the universal solution, but getting the 6:3 ratio into the right place and getting your 3 index up above 8%, and I'm channeling Bill Harris here. If you do both of those things, at that point, it is almost impossible for you to have chronic inflammatory stress. From what I see, and we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of cases now, this approach is about almost as effective, maybe I would say more effective in some cases, than putting someone on glucocorticoids, which are the most powerful anti-inflammatory drugs we have at the moment, but you can't use them over long periods of time because this creates serious, serious adverse effects. What we have by rebalancing the 6:3 ratio, bringing up the 3 index, and reconstituting the cell membranes in a way that makes it impossible. You can still have acute inflammation, which is good. You cannot have chronic inflammation, which is bad. When you do this, a lot of symptoms of the most serious diseases start becoming less severe, less frequent, and in many cases, they go away. But this is only addressing the chronic inflammatory component. It's not having really any significant effect on the other 3. Those are quite different drivers of disease, and each one of them has to be approached with a different antidote.
So how does test-based nutrition help us to personalize interventions for all this, all the different individuals biochemically?
I think that if you're treating people with a xenomolecule, a pharmaceutical, a large audience that you're giving them to is by definition, it's virginal. They haven't received or experienced that new drug before. So it's a meaningful test bed. You can give the same drug to everyone, and most people will respond in broadly the same kind of way. There'll be individual sensitivities. Sometimes adverse effects will appear in one and not the other, but you're starting off on a level playing field. If you are recommending nutrients to people and you haven't tested them, you don't know who you're giving those nutrients to. Some people may already have good omega-3 status and others won't. The ones who already have good omega-3 status won't respond to your intervention. The ones who have very low status, they'll give a response which is maybe more than you would have expected. So I think that it actually behooves us to test people beforehand. If someone has a really good test result, the way Zinzino works is we'll say to people, and this is very European, you might find it a little odd, we'll say, you don't need us. We don't want to medicalize you. You paid $90 for the test. You have had such a good result. We'll give you your money back. And you don't need us anymore. It would be wrong of us to try and convince them that they did. However, if you take that test, it's a blood stick. You could do at home, 3 or 4 drops of blood on a filter paper. Easiest thing in the world to do. If you do that, and it does give you a bad result, then firstly, that is a pretty good piece of evidence that shows you that over time, this chronic inflammatory impulse will eventually come to the surface as the symptom of a chronic degenerative inflammatory condition. These are very common because of the way in which we live. So if you have this problem, if you have a bad reading, we would then say, okay, you can do 2 things. Change your diet. Start eating a lot more mackerel and herring and wild salmon. That's great. You can do it that way. Or you can use our product and then test yourself again in 3 months, 4 months time. And you can see that the needles have changed, that the 6-to-3 ratio has come all the way down. As it comes down, as it passes that magic threshold of about 5-to-1, lo and behold, the chronic inflammatory symptoms fade away. And we've seen this in hundreds of thousands of cases. So if the inflammatory symptoms are, let's say, arthritic joint pain, they start to go away. This is what I had before I started taking Balancol. If they are an inflammatory dermatological condition, that starts to disappear, starts to fade out as the 6-to-3 index falls. And it was essential hypertension. Same thing, same thing. All of these conditions have a very major chronic inflammatory component. And if you use the test, you can see your chemistry, your cell membrane chemistry change. And as it changes, your symptoms improve.
That's excellent. Can you explain to our audience, if there's some people that are unfamiliar with why balance oil is different from a traditional fish oil?
Well, it works. And traditional fish oil doesn't. So don't just take my word for this, folks. Traditional fish oil has been tested and tested and tested again by many of my colleagues and by an international consortium known as the Cochrane Collaboration. These are the good and the great world famous scientists who conduct meta-analyses of things like this. And they have shown repeatedly that fish oil does not protect you from coronary artery disease or cancer or dementia or anything, really, which is very odd because we know that eating oily fish does have positive health outcomes. And we kind of worked out what this situation meant back in 2015. I published the first paper, which was published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, saying, well, hang on, fish oil and oily fish are completely different things. The oily fish contains a combination of nutrients which do wonderful things to us, but you need 2 of them in particular. You need omega-3s and a very interesting subset of compounds called polyphenols. When you put them together, that's what reduces inflammation. If you strip the polyphenols out, which is what the commercial fish oil industry does, you end up with pure omega-3s. And not only are they not effective, they have now been implicated in increasing the risk of developing atrial fibrillation. It's not a good thing to do. And now we have some Japanese data which says it probably increases the risk of lung cancer. So the fish oil companies are selling a product which they have long known is not effective, and we are now beginning to realize may actually be counterproductive. This is the data that I'm starting to publish, and I can tell you that the fish oil industry doesn't like it, but I don't think they should be in business unless they can, A, demonstrate therapeutic effects, and B, demonstrate safety. At the moment, they cannot do either. Now, the difference between fish oil and balance oil is we add the polyphenols back into the fish oil and effectively reconstitute the whole fish. The reason why the polyphenols are important, they do 2 things. They're chaperones. They bind very tightly to the omega-3s, which the alpha tocopherol doesn't do. And they protect the omega-3s as they pass through the small intestine, the portal circulation, the liver, the general circulation, and they protect the omega-3s throughout this difficult transition until they can be incorporated into the membranes of your cells and all of your peripheral tissues, which is where they are active. And once the polyphenols have done that and deposited the omega-3s in the tissues where they're needed, the polyphenols then adopt a new responsibility. This is another function of this class of compounds, and they switch off the inflammatory cascade at a different point where the omega-3s come in. And the inflammatory cascade is a long and complex process. The omega-3s cut it off at the top, and the polyphenols come in and cut it off at the bottom. So all this pharmacology is quite well known now. We know how it works. And this is, I think, the reason why we're not getting so many doctors working with us, like yourself. We're also recruiting from within the ranks of the NIH, which was a surprise to me. They're now working with us quite extensively. And we're working with doctors in over 120 countries at the last count.
Yeah, it's really wonderful and something that, most traditional medical education leaves out. Nutrition is a very small part. And,
Yeah.
I have so many patients that don't understand this. They're on meds chronically and they think they're just relegated to a life of being on these meds because their parents had it. It's in my genetics. I can't make the change. So, how do we as clinicians impress upon our patients the benefits of omega-6 testing and pharmaconutrition when they're so used to symptom-based care and get overwhelmed by thinking, oh, I have to add something else in to try to get off my meds, and I don't think I'll ever be able to get off these meds.
Well, it's the mindset. It's the mindset. And we are encouraged, or we have been encouraged by the medical profession, and in particular by the pharmaceutical industry, to think of health in terms of a reactive healthcare system. Just go on doing what you're doing. Eat healthy, eat clean, if you even know what that means. I don't know what eating clean means. And then when you finally run into trouble, as you will, because everybody does here in North America, because the diet, frankly, is so bad, don't worry, we'll patch you up. We'll keep you going with these extremely toxic pharmaceuticals. That's what we call a reactive system of healthcare. We wait until you get sick, and then we will try and patch you up. It's ruinously expensive. It's singularly ineffective because public health is just falling off a cliff. I could name you 80 different chronic degenerative conditions, all of them more common, and most of which are occurring earlier in life, that are being driven by the diet. Now, if only we could reconfigure the key components of that diet, you wouldn't get to that point where you were starting to get sick anyway. Now, that sounds like pie in the sky. And we won't stop anybody at the end of their lives from getting sick and dying. But what we do know from historical databases, and we have millions of data points now, that you have a choice. You can start to develop the symptoms of these conditions in your late 40s, early 50s, and then coast slowly downhill, becoming progressively more sick, requiring progressively more medications, and consuming more healthcare and becoming more expensive. Or if you approach this correctly from a nutritional, pharmaconutritional perspective, you can stay fully functional. And I mean, in every sense that you can think of, the, in physical, mental, sexual health, in complete independence, being able to look after yourself and be completely functional until the last months, maybe weeks or days of a much quicker death, which is generally from a very different type of cause. This is what the 19th century data tells us. You can die for the last third of your life slowly, painfully, and expensively, or you can stay healthy right until the end and then fall off the perch relatively quickly and relatively inexpensively. Now, I hate to put a monetary value on these things, but we have to because so many people in this country do have chronic degenerative disease. And it's at that point now where the increasing costs that are being incurred by the healthcare systems are leading inevitably to rationing, more and more rationing of healthcare. And you know very well that here in the United States, where you do not have socialized medicine, I'm not here to have a political discussion about this, that becoming ill is the single most common cause of homelessness and bankruptcy. This is not a good medical system. We could do something better. And by establishing a pharmaconutritional basis, we can do just that.
Yes, so we have so many innovations coming through, and what is most exciting to you now in this field?
One of the things that I'm actually very proud of is the gut balance test, which is very new. Up until now, if you had dysbiosis, first of all, it was difficult to demonstrate that, but if you really wanted to drill down into it, you would have to go to a clinic or a lab and provide a stool sample, and then they would do microbial analysis or genetic. They'd look at the the microbiome, that is, do a kind of genetic analysis of all the material there, and try and work out, do you have the right populations of microbes in the large intestine? And of course, it's not just in the large intestine. You have a microbiota in the large intestine, but every other tissue in one too. There is no tissue or system in the body that is sterile. But the largest one is in the lower intestine, and that cross-talks with the microbiota in many other tissues, including the skin, the placenta, the brain, blood, everywhere else. So it's important. We know it's not configured correctly because of the way in which the diet is shifted, particularly here in North America. And the microbiome has been shifted away from saccharolytic microbes, so basically microbes that prefer to consume prebiotic fibers, to proteolytic microbes, because the prebiotic fibers have largely gone from our diet. So we now are full of bacteria that consume proteins. Where do they get that protein from? Not from our diet, because the proteins that you consume are digested and absorbed in the small intestine. The microbes that inhabit our large intestines now, the proteins that they consume are largely mucins. These are polyglycosylated proteins that form the mucus layer, which lies over our cells, the colonocytes that line the intestine and protects them. Once these proteolytic species have eroded enough of the mucus layer, they come into direct contact with our colonocytes. And because so many of these microbes are gram-negative, which means they're coated in lipopolysaccharide, this immediately causes intense chronic inflammatory stress, which is deeply implicated in IBS and IBD, but it's not just a local problem because now you start developing leaky gut, and these toxic lipoproteins migrate into the bloodstream, they hit the liver. This is one of the reasons why we have so much NAFLD, or what people now call MASLD, liver disease of this sort, is now affecting almost 40% of the global population, or rather more, in North America. And it's having knock-on pathological effects on cardiovascular health, neurological health, and a whole other array of healthcare problems. So the biggest meta-analysis that we have so far shows that if you eat more of the right kinds of fibers, your risk of early death is reduced by over 30%, which is huge. So less heart disease, less cardiovascular, cerebrovascular disease, less cancers, less dementia. It's a really good thing to do. How can we test? How do we know who needs fiber? We need a different test because the microbial analysis is not really at a point, even now, where it has particularly good predictive value. We've taken a different route. We started to look at something that's much closer to clinical significance and functionality, which is the colonic epithelial barrier membrane. So if you have the right microbes in the lower intestine, this epithelial barrier is functioning as it should, keeping the toxic stuff inside the gut, not letting into the bloodstream. How do you measure that? Different ways. We tried a few of them. Now what we have settled on is looking at tryptophan metabolites and the ratio between tryptophan from the diet and two key metabolites, IPA and kynurenine. If you have the right microbiota, the tryptophan that you're consuming tends to be broken down to IPA, which is associated with very significant health benefits in a whole array of tissues. If you have the wrong microbes and inflammation in the lower intestine, nope, the tryptophan is now going down a different road. It's shunted into the kynurenine pathway, and this is neurotoxic and cytotoxic and really bad for you. So once again, we have a dry blood spot test, something you can do at home, at your own time, at your own convenience. 2 or 3 blood drops onto a filter paper. You send it off to a third party, independent, validated forensic analytical laboratory. And a couple of weeks later, you go online and it will show you the relative ratios of tryptophan, IPA, kynurenine. And this is enough to tell you, do you have the right microbial profile in the lower intestine or the wrong? If you do have the wrong one, start including more of the right kinds of fibers in your diet. Within 2 weeks, you can see the ratios changing away from the toxic metabolites towards the beneficial ones. Now, this is a huge development in microbiomal analysis, and we are very confident that any doctor who's interested in dysbiosis is going to want to have access to this. So we will be producing a version of it, particularly for the medical profession, but there will be another version available for home use. And we will be launching that at the October annual meeting in Oslo this year.
That is very exciting, and it bypasses having to have patients send stool samples in the mail and deal with that. And just having a simple blood spot will be so much more accessible for people.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think your mail services approves of people sending fecal sample material through the mail. I can't imagine why, but I don't think they like
So, Dr. Clayton, what are your personal non-negotiables when it comes to nutrition and lifestyle? You're the expert.
Well, I really, I've been around for a long time and I'm very old-fashioned in my general approach. I think we should bring what used to be called domestic science back into the school curriculum. Back in the day, and certainly when I was a child growing up in Scotland, domestic science was a part of every school curriculum. And what it really meant was teaching people how to cook. And we've, I think, largely forgotten that. Living in North America as I do, I think we're now in an age of gastropornography. All these wonderful cooking programs are on television, on the internet, and lots of books with beautiful photographs showing how to cook. How many people actually do cook? Most people on this continent are consuming captive meals. That is, they're eating in restaurants, in cafeterias, they're buying ready meals from, the local grocery store. Not many people cook, and there are reasons for it. It can be expensive working with basic produce, or people think it is because basic produce tends to have a short shelf life. You need time to do the shopping, to do the preparation, to do the cooking. A lot of people are very time poor. I get it. But I think if we could encourage people to do more of that when they go to the supermarket, to go around the corners, the edges of the store, and go for the fresh produce rather than go for the central aisles where the ultra processed foods tend to be. This, for me, would be the first step. Now, for those who are willing to cook and can cook and have time to do it, and all the things that go along with that, that's great. And what about everybody else? The people who don't have the time or the inclination to do that? Well, then the next best thing is to go for hacks, biohacks. And that's what these Enzino programs are for. So if you're eating a diet that is less than perfect, you can add these biohacks into your regime and gain all of the advantages of what a really optimized diet should be.
What is one thing that you wish more physicians knew when it comes to this, to inflammation and personalized care, pharmaconutrition? If you could say one thing to finish us out here.
I think the one idea I'd like to get across to my medical colleagues, and we're doing that increasingly in Europe. I have to say, North America is a little bit of a holdout because of the tentacles of the pharmaceutical industry. But I would say this, that many of your patients, whatever they're presenting as, whatever their conditions are, many, in fact, most of these pathologies are being driven by four simple drivers: chronic inflammatory stress, dysbiosis, type B malnutrition, and glycemic mismatch. And each one of those is very simple to deal with. So we're not talking about exposing your patients to new, exciting, untested drugs and a whole range of adverse side effects and huge medical bills. We're saying to the doctors, here are some very simple, basic things you can put in place, which are going to make your patient's life a lot easier and enable you to be a better doctor.
That's wonderful. Thank you for your insight. Do you have time if we can open the floor to any questions the audience may have?
I arrived a little bit late for your meeting, for which I apologize. The least I can do is to give you as much time as you want.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you.
Guys, anybody got questions? Please ask them, unmute yourself and ask them, or put it in the chat. Dr. Paul, I'll ask you one. Type B malnutrition would be Extend. Can you tell us a little bit about Extend and the importance of beta glucans in it?
Yes, of course. Well, multivitamins and multiminerals don't work. I mentioned the Cochrane collaboration. They've tested those too, and they've shown on numerous occasions that multivitamins and minerals just don't work. So why on earth would we bother selling one? Well, we don't. Extend isn't really a multivitamin or multimineral at all. it combines all the classic micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, but that's only as the foundation. Because onto that foundation, we've built several other layers. So that includes, for example, a full range of all of the biologically and nutritionally important carotenoids, uh, xanthophyll, a group of polyphenolic compounds, some of which are more hydrophilic, some of which are lipophilic, and the whole point of that is to uh, provide antioxidant and anti-inflammatory cover in a whole range of different end organs and tissues. On top of that, we have added the 1316 beta glucan, which are not quite as well known, but I'm sure that your audience, who I understand include a number of therapists, probably do know what these compounds are. They are the most intensively and expensively studied immunomodulatory compounds that have been identified. Now, in one of my previous lives, I chaired the scientific advisory board of Biothera, which at that time was the lead company researching 1316 beta glucans, and we received $300 million invested. We invested into this one group of compounds, 100 million of which we got from the NIH. Now, the reason why the NIH funded us was because they were beginning to become aware of how important these compounds were in upregulating innate immunity in a way that makes you more resistant to infection and less likely to develop the symptoms of allergy. So it's a complicated story, but these compounds are, broadly speaking, you find them in the cell wall of certain microorganisms, in particular yeasts, such as Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that Baker's yeast, which doesn't cause any illness. But when the immune system spots these particular compounds, it assumes that there may be some kind of a problem with an invading microorganism, and so it becomes more active. The mitochondria in your innate immune cells, neutrophils and macrophages, are epigenetically shifted. So they start to produce more energy, which means your immune cells can now move more quickly to the site of an infection. And when they get there, tackle it more aggressively than they otherwise could. When that happens, it has a knock-on effect on certain elements in the adaptive immune system, which reduce your risk of allergy. Now, there's a lot of literature about this. When I first started researching these compounds, there were perhaps 2-3 dozen research papers that had been describing the work that had been done with them. I think there's now more than 1,000. And if you go to PubMed or any of the other medical databases, you will get an overview of just how effective these compounds are in restoring immunological health. And so we've included that in Extend as well.
Okay, thank you. We have a few questions coming in. The first being, how does focai fit in?
Well, focai is a little bit the odd one out. And this is a very interesting compound that is extracted from spirulina. Spirulina has been around for millennia. And these microalgae have been part of the human food chain, actually going back to the Neolithic age and beyond. We've seen really robust archaeological records of this. Spirulina itself is a pretty good source of amino acids and various vitamins and minerals, but it also contains low levels of this substance called phycocyanin. And unlike spirulina, which is green, phycocyanin is a rather striking blue color. It's been getting a lot of attention lately because it has been shown in a number of studies to have a whole range of chemotherapeutic properties. That is, it has the ability to exert a number of effects on a wide range of cancer cells, which we have reason to believe will translate into significant clinical benefits. I cannot say any more. It would be illegal for me to do so. But if I, at some point in my life, were to develop clinical cancer, I would most certainly include phycocyanin in my regime. I wouldn't rely on it exclusively, but it's something that I don't think anyone interested in this kind of thing can afford to overlook.
Okay. Someone is asking, what role does Protect play?
Well, Protect is a little bit like a very stripped down version of Extend. Extend is relatively more expensive because there are so many other things in it. Protect just contains the beta-glucans. It's a very simple version of including the beta-glucans in your diet in a way that will make you better able to resist infection, have less problems with immunity. It's like, I mean, we used to consume large amounts of these molecules, these 1316 beta-glucans, because yeasts, frankly, were everywhere. We used to eat far more fermented foods than we do now. Fermented foods include bread, if it's made in the traditional way with baker's yeast, or beers and wines. And back in the day, not only did we consume more bread, but it was raised in such a way that it did contain more beta-glucans. Same with beers and wines. We still make them with yeast, of course, but we now use ultrafiltration to remove all sediment. And when we do that, we remove the beta-glucans from our beers and wines as well. The third major dietary source of these beta-glucans was in trace levels, background contamination, which occurred in just about every food that we ate, whether it was confectionery, baked goods, fruits, anything. All of them contained background levels of yeast because these cells are present in almost every breath of air that you take. They're everywhere, which is something that the alembic beer makers in Belgium know. For example, the alembic beer makers just leave the brew open rather than adding a standardized yeast to it. They leave it open and they know that in a short period of time, it will become colonized with the yeast cells that are in the air. So we used to be exposed and we used to ingest significant levels of these compounds, and then food practices changed. Beer and wine production was changed, bread production methods changed, and the countryside, instead of giving us relatively unprocessed fruits and vegetables and other foods, now became a chemical battleground and is sprayed consistently with biocides, including fungicides. And so the background levels of yeast contaminants in the foods that we ate have gone as well. Now, there are reasons for doing that. We probably don't have time to get into all of that now. But the sum total, the net effect of all of these changes has been to take these beta-glucans out of the diet where they always used to be, leaving our immune systems exposed, unbalanced, and dysfunctional as an end result. When we take 1316 beta-glucans in a capsule, such as in Protect, we're simply restoring normality.
That was a great explanation. Can you explain the purge that people experience after 2 months of being on the full health protocol?
Well, it's complicated. If you're talking about a purge, not that many people will report that. I mean, frankly, that's something that I don't very often see at all. I think in some cases, what you're seeing is probably something akin to a Herxheimer reaction. I think in other cases, it's very hard to talk about detoxification. I mean, I know this is a popular subject, but what is detox? Are you talking about getting rid of heavy metals from the body? Are you talking about getting rid of organic contaminants? Are you talking about rectifying the microbiota? All of these things sort of fit into the general heading of detox, but you have to approach them all in quite different ways. In my experience, people who move on to the health protocol, there is not really a kind of a purging effect. You see a gradual reduction and then cessation of the symptoms of many of the lifestyle disorders. That would be far more common experience.
Okay, thank you. The last question we have here is olive oil itself, especially extra virgin olive oil, contains quite high concentrations of polyphenols. How does
Yes.
it compare to taking separately extra virgin olive oil and omega-3 oils in combination in comparison to the balance oil itself?
You know, you could try mixing up your own balance oil. Easily done. You could take fish oil, commercial fish oil, and add extra virgin olive oil and shake it up and drink it, and it is disgusting. It really does not taste good at all. But if you want to do that, you're welcome to do it. So what we have to do when we're making something to make it palatable, to make it relatively pleasant to drink, we do we have some very good food technologists who are helping us to do that. But the problems are a little bit deeper. If you're looking at EVO, extra virgin olive oil, it does have higher levels of some of the polyphenols than the cheaper brands of olive oil. But not that much higher. If you want very high levels of these polyphenols, and there's different polyphenols, and they're not all the same, you have to actually pick the olives before they're ripe. So the levels of polyphenols, they go up in the olives and they reach a peak. And then once the olive moves towards ripeness, the polyphenol levels fall, and that's when we harvest the olive. So the levels are already way below their peak. What we do is we cheat nature a little bit. We pick the olives before they're ripe at the moment when they have peak polyphenol levels, and that is the olive oil that we add to the fish oil. You wouldn't want to do this at home because this olive oil, with its very high levels of polyphenols, has an acrid and, I would say, a rather bitter taste, which not many people would want to drink day in, day out.
It looks like we're best to leave it in the experts' hands and stay on balance oil. So, Dr. Clayton, thank you so much. This has been incredibly insightful. You've really helped connect the science of nutrition with the practical tools that we really do need as clinicians.
Thank you.
Um, and to everyone who joined us from around the world, thank you. I hope this conversation gave you new clarity, conviction, and clinical tools to bring into your work and bring to your patients and your clients.
Can I plug my website?
Of course, please do.
Okay, because Daniel, as you probably know, there's a bunch of books out there. I write a lot of scientific papers as well, 3 or 4 every year. But there's a website where all of this is very freely available. You don't have to buy the books, you don't have to pay anything at all. It's all there. The website is drpaulclayton.eu. That's drpaulclayton.eu. I haven't posted anything for a couple of months because I'm working on a whole series of mediconomic papers, but there's an enormous amount of material there. It's all very heavily referenced, and I'll get back to work as soon as I've finished the mediconomic analysis.
Excellent. Well, I'll be heading there to check it out. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much for talking to me, Daniel.